Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you here for the first session of the second day of Gulf. Uh, when we came in, we were intimidated by the chairs. Now we are intimidated by you. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure and a delight to be in conversation with Ranjit as always. For us, I think conversations like these are just continuations of conversations we would have anywhere else. Whether over lunch or just sitting idly or even traveling together. And that is the richness of a kind of mutuality. Ranjit has used a phrase quite often, which now I have taken to use also, Saharidai.
Indeed.
There is a Saharidai here, which goes across lives, practices, what we write, and what we appreciate. He was kind enough to be an interlocutor with me yesterday for my book. I am not even returning the favor. I'm just continuing the conversation. So let us talk about this wonderful book of translations, The Homelands and Ocean, TAQI Mir's selected ashar. This is a book that we saw coming, friends of Ranjit. If you have been following him on social media, you would have seen this book coming, because for the last few years, he has been posting, a share and its translation for, as he does them, as his fancy catches him. And I think probably we told you more than a year back or more than 2 years back that this has to end up in a book at some point, which we are very happy that it, in fact, has ended up. This is not Ranjit's first foray into translation. He has also been translating Ghalib on and off, I think, although I don't know whether they are published as yet. He has invoked Ghalib in his own poetry. His other translation, of course, is the very celebrated Ay Lalla, the poems of Lal Ded. And amongst his various other writings and various other publications, a new translation is always something that we anticipate and look forward to. What we had not anticipated, when he was casually posting on Facebook and Instagram and all that, is this book and the way it is, because more than half of this book is the introduction. And believe me, that is worth the price of admission. The introduction of this book sets Mir Taqi Mir in an absolutely wonderful context, both of his time as well as of his writing, as well as of the kind of language he uses and the historical processes that run through all these things. And those are some interesting things that I hope we can discuss. Mir also forms, a part of a very rough canon of well-loved Urdu poets. You would have Mir and Ghalib and then Iqbal and Faiz and so on. But Mir is the earliest. And he is also a kind of, which I would like to talk about, a proto-Urdu poet. Everybody would put him in the canon of Urdu poetry, which is fine, I suppose. But the fact that he kind of comes even before a language is developed or a language is formalized is a very special location, I think, in the history of literature. And Mir kind of represents that particular space. So this book is a book with a very long and deeply involved introduction, and then a collection of shares and their translations. So we'll talk about both these things, because at one point they look almost like two books. But let us take the time and slowly unravel this part. So, Ranjit, I think the best thing I can do is to begin by asking you that you have written somewhere in this book itself is that Mir never wrote in Urdu. So, would you please explain yourself?
Sure. Okay. I think I might just borrow the mic. Mustansir, thank you very much indeed for your warm and generous framing of the project and for these reflections on where poetry and translation come from and how they are grounded for many of us in friendship and in exchanges that go back over many decades now. And also thank you all of you for coming up this morning. Like you said, at 9:45, which for me too is an ungodly hour. If I didn't want to show up, who else would? But here you are. So thank you very much indeed. But to answer your question about the language, I think we have to look back at these linguistic questions through the lens of today, which is profoundly toxic. It's rife with misunderstandings. And there's also sometimes a sense that language has a pattern of progress from a relatively rudimentary phase to a more sophisticated one. I think all of these are dangerous myths to work with. Particularly of Urdu, it is said that someone like Mir, and even a brilliant seminal scholar like Gopi Chand Naran would say of Mir, oh, he wrote at a relatively early phase of the language. And you want to say, it's not that the language gets more sophisticated necessarily, it's just that it goes through different phases and each should be cherished in and of itself. So when you think about Mir, who lived from 1723 to 1810, across one of the most turbulent centuries in Indian South Asian history, he was drawing on a linguistic landscape which is rich and vibrant and complex. I mean, as I've argued here, you see him between a formal, relatively formal Persian, which, as I've argued, is really an Indian language. And it certainly was. In the 18th and 19th century, there was far more Persian being written and published in South Asia than in Iran. Qajar, Iran, has had its own fixations with Arabic. This is not something we often realize because we think about the modern nation state. So Persian, Iran, Hindi, India. It's a mistake to link a language to a nation state. So there was Persian, which was real and present to somebody like Mir, not only in court circles, but also in a whole range of other circulations. And then there was for Mir and his contemporaries what I've called the Hindavi continuum, which is 18 or 19 languages that spread from the Shivaliks to Telangana and from Rajasthan to eastern Bihar. And these are the languages, each one rich in its literature, in performance, in song, in hymn, recitation, which are now seen as dialects that made way for this incredible official standard Hindi that we are now told is Hindi. And so I'm thinking here of Bhojpuri, Braj, Awadhi, Magahi, Bundeli, and a whole range of others. And Mir spent his early years in Akbarabad, Agra. Then he moves to Shah Jahanabad, today Delhi. Spends time in exile in the Jat strongholds in Kumair and Deeg, and eventually ends up in Awadh and Lucknow. So through his life, you see this man really creating a language, and he's very aware. If you look at his language, there are turns of Khadi Boli, there are Braj turns of phrase. You really sense all of this. Unlike in the next generation, Ghalib, who saw himself as a Persian poet who was doing Urdu readers a favor by writing in Urdu. So his Urdu is full of complex izafats. It's highly Persianate. So what it also reminds us of is the fact that Urdu, as you said, Urdu didn't even have that name till 1780. Otherwise it was called Rekhta, it was called Hindi. I might just read one of these ashar.
Yeah.
The Mir actually makes much play with this linguistic scenario. So here's one where he says, "Kya janu log kehte hain kisko surur-e qalb, aaya nahi ye lafz to Hindi zuban ke beech." How would I know what folks call the heart's pleasance, that posh word hasn't made its way into Hindi yet.
This is an interesting time, as you say, because and a very turbulent time, between kind of Mir's life spans itself between these two very vicious raids into
Yeah.
the Delhi Agra area. I think by
Nadir Shah in the first place.
Nadir Shah, the first part of his life, and towards the end, Ahmad Shah Abdali's several raids. And it is during this kind of turbulent time that Mir grows, lives from place to place, and of course, writes. I wonder whether that impacts his writing. Incidentally, since we are talking about language, it's precisely this, I think, that must have also triggered the evolution of the language, because all these areas would be places in which there would be a complete cross confluence of people from all over India, especially in the army camps.
Yeah.
And the people in the army camps would speak a variety of languages, and then at some point in time have come to some commonality, which would then become Urdu.
Yeah. But also a very complex cartography of people moving across the subcontinent. So it would be soldiers, but also saints and merchants. People who had different reasons to crisscross South Asia.
Yeah.
And it also went in relatively unpredictable ways. There was also the great presence of Dakhani in the emergence of Urdu, which has been downplayed. It's not least by Mir in his role as an anthologist, but it's really the fact that Wali Dakhani's work comes up into Delhi and Agra, from the Deccan through Gujarat to the north. It really brings into play a very different way of using language, making it colloquial, making it polychrome in a certain way. So when you look at these circulations, you're also thinking about people who were open to exchange. In today's terms, one would think of them as being xenophilic in a certain way. We are preoccupied and we are allowing ourselves to be shaped by xenophobia, the hate of the other. These were people who were xenophilic in a certain way. Not
They
to wish
absorbed
away.
things.
Yeah, I mean, of course there were conflicts, of course there were disagreements. But along with that went this ability to open oneself to the other. And I think it explains why we have these complex and multi-layered languages and their literatures emerging at this period.
I'd like you to read a few shares, if you can, particularly addressing this idea that since the languages had not yet been kind of formalized into that kind of language situation, where you have the grammars and things like that in place, and they also then you tend to get a bit obsessive about it, or what is correctness. There is a much greater freedom of the manner in which you can speak, or in which you can use the words that you know in the manner that you want to put them together in what we call a parole, in what we call the way a language is in fact used on the street rather than the way a language is formalized. And if you could give a few examples of Mir's writing that actually shows this kind of ease or looseness.
Sure. But let me also just frame this by saying that there were multiple processes of linguistic experimentation at work. Now you think about Mir, this is a man who's experimenting with various linguistic registers. But his maternal step-uncle, with whom he actually spends a few years as a teenager, is Khani Arzu, Sirajuddin Khani Arzu, who is a philologist, who is working at that point on a comparative study of Persian and Sanskrit. These are not things we are encouraged to remember today. So we have to look back at this landscape where there were also grammarians, philologists, people who had seen. We tend to think this comes out of German Romanticism and German philology.
And later.
And then this was already underway in the 17th and 18th centuries. There are bodies of knowledge and forms of attention that would be forgotten about, because also we don't have access to these things, to our own heritage. So let me read the first sher in the book. Remember, these are 150 ashar of something like 13,585 ashar that Mir wrote. His collected works go into 6 volumes. So this is a small selection, and I've also chosen to translate couplets. I don't like that.
I'll talk to you about that.
Okay, but I'm not the ghazal. Okay, we'll talk about it later. Fine, so we hold on to that thought. All right, here goes. This is the verse that opens the book. शायर हो मत चुप के रहो अब चुप में जाने जाती हैं बात करो अब ब्यात पढ़ो कुछ बैतें हमको बताते रहो. You're a poet, don't be silent. Lives are lost under cover of silence. Speak up, read a couple of lines, read us verses, keep talking to us.
Much more accessible language.
It is. But also linguistically, if you look at the second line, there are 2 plurals for bet. Bet, as many of us know.
And bet.
Yeah, a bet is Arabic for house or home. In Urdu also it means the ground of the verse to which you return. But notice that he has 2 forms of plural. He says abyat, which is the high Perso-Arabic plural. And there's beting, which comes straight from the Gangetic Demotic version. So even in a single line, there's linguistic play. If you catch it, you do. If you don't, well, you don't. Some more?
Please.
But also there's a in this reading of Mir, what I was at pains to do was to cut against the grain of the standard interpretation, which is that he's a poet of love, of thwarted love, of melancholia, and so on and so forth, which is very reductive and really ignores what seems to me to be very clearly a political Mir, someone who was alive to those circumstances that you mentioned earlier. I mean, when he's a teenager, Delhi is really destroyed by Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah recedes, and then for about 20 years through the poet's life, you have 8 raids by Ahmad Shah Abdali. There are Rohilla uprisings. For 3 months, the emperor is taken prisoner. Variously, the Mughals are at the mercy of the Marathas, the Rohillas, the Jats, the Rajputs. So, and then the East India Company on the horizon. So these poems are being written at a time of incredible turbulence when, as I've described him, he's really the poet of a shattered world. So what forms of collective being is he thinking about? How does he respond to this elegiac scenario? These are questions that come up too. And he traces his way to this through linguistic revelry in a strange way. So maybe I could read a couple of these and then we can. धूप में जलती हैं गुर्बत वतनों की लाशें तेरे कूचे में मगर साया एक दीवार न था धूप में जलती हैं गुर्बत वतनों की लाशें तेरे कूचे में मगर साया एक दीवार न था. The sun burns up the corpses of those driven from their homeland. Your lane did not offer them even the shadow of a wall. This next one is full of incredible alliteration that one can't easily get across. कर खौफ कलक खस्त की जो सुर्ख हैं आंखें जलते हैं तरो खुश्क भी मिस्कीन के गजब में. Fear those who huddle around fires, their eyes red, both wet and dry will burn in the rage of the oppressed. हम भी इस शहर में उन लोगों से है खाने खराब मीर घर बार जिनों के राह सैलाब में है. I too am one of those people in this city whose homes have been trashed, Mir. whose everything lies in the flood's path.
There's one thing you do talk about in your introduction, and that is this whole idea of not to look at Mir as a particularly melancholic poet, but you do talk about his times and the circumstances, which are considerably less melancholic, and there's a lot of revelry and a lot of other kinds of comradeship. And he also ends up, I think, making a compilation of risque jokes and things like that.
Totally.
I wonder if you can talk about that and why are they not in this book?
Because they're in Naeem Saab's book. That's another story. We're also thinking, as we were talking about how this is a moment when language itself is being created, it's also a moment when different kinds of genres are being developed, really. So, alongside this great divan in Urdu, Mir also wrote a number of works in Farsi, in Persian, which was, of course, the manner, because all of these people we're thinking about were multilingual. So, one of these is the Zikr-e-Mir, which is usually described as an autobiography, but if you look at its structure, there are three parts. The first is it's a homage to his father, who he presents as a Sufi, and the second part is fragmentary memoirs of the attacks on Delhi and what happened, and the third is that collection of off-color jokes and anecdotes, which for years were suppressed in the Urdu canon until very recently when Urdu Ghar has published them, which is quite a revolutionary moment. But they do appear in the Murthy Classical Library's edition of Zikr-e-Mir translated by C.M. Naim. So there's that. But also, we're thinking of somebody who participates in the emergence of a whole new genre in this time of turbulence. It's called Sheher-Ashob, the lament for the city. That genre begins originally as a form of writing in Persian, which is a celebration of the marvels of the city. As an architect, you'll warm to that. But under pressure of these invasions and the forms of destruction suffered, it turns, particularly in Urdu, into this form of elegy for not only the city and its architecture, but the relationships, the things that bound people together, the forms of sociality. Because these were all incredibly social beings, which is why that image of the Urdu poet as solitary and melancholy is just empirically nonsensical. Because these poems came to life in social circumstances, at the Mushaira, the Mehfil. These also, because we now think about them in print, we forget that they participated in a larger life of dance, of music, all of which, astonishingly enough, orality, which was alive and vibrant even during the meltdowns. And the great fear of many of these people, Catherine Schofield has a brilliant book on this subject, was the possibility that they would all be scattered and lose touch with each other, and that they might not find cultivated audiences where they went to Hyderabad, Lucknow, Bengal. Eventually they did, but that's another story.
And as an extension, could you also talk a little bit about patronage? Because a lot of these writings, these shares, would probably emerge under the canopy of patronage.
Impossible without that. In fact, with my social sciences training as my great curse, I can't help but make these lists. I've listed the 7 major patrons that Mir had.
7.
At least 7 patrons, major patrons through his life. And they were varied. They were all very powerful, ranging from a psychopathic vizier who became Grand Vizier at 17 to actually a generous Jat nobleman who then takes him into exile. That's when Delhi goes through its worst period. But the fact is that poets like Mir and later Ghalib really needed patrons. They didn't. They just saw that as part of the social armature that would support their work. which is why so much of Ghalib's writing, apart from his poems and his memoirs, they're letters, they're petitions to various rulers calling for, the renewal of his pension, for instance. Yeah. But also, it's a very socially precarious scenario for these people. Amir, on the one hand, never lets anyone forget that he's really Hijazi, that his ancestors came from Arabia, that he's a Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet. But on the other hand, he's very, very aware his existence is at the mercy of
these people.
Rulers, patrons, courtiers. Likewise with Khalid, who's also...
In fact, a large part of their life is obsessed with this.
Absolutely. Which is also why I think we need to return these poets to their material basis in a certain way. I think it offers us a much better sense of where the poetry is coming from and what it addresses. So I think the tendency in the commentatorial tradition has been to isolate the poetry as being purely a matter of form and convention. What Francis Pritchett and Farooqi sometimes describe as the Ghazal universe.
Yeah.
So in the book I talk about how there's a doubling or a twinning you see in many of the verses where they are part of the formal Ghazal universe, but they're also what I've thought of as the Ghurbat universe, the world of exile, trauma, and suffering.
So is that a metaphor in the sense that you can take a sher and look at it as part of the Ghurbat universe?
Yeah.
As opposed to being part of the Ghazal universe?
I think that speaks to the richness of reading. I think those verses actually can be read in both of these frameworks. You don't have to choose, and which is why they're classics. We're still reading them today because they open themselves out to different forms of interpretation.
So I'd like to now turn to the latter half of the book, which is a collection of these ashars. And of course, traditionally, one would have expected you to translate the entire ghazals. But what you have done instead is pick the shairs. And that is, I think, a statement by itself, that you just pick the couplets and then let the couplets stand as a poem, as an independent poem by themselves. So I'd like to ask you why you chose to do that. And do I lose something in not reading the entire ghazal and in not being able to look at that sher in the context of what comes before and after that?
A very rich question. So let me begin to try and unpack the answer. For one, at least in this book, I'm putting forward the argument that it's almost impossible to translate a ghazal. This is a polemical argument, obviously. It can be done. I've done it with Ghalib. That work is not yet published. But the reason I say that is because when we read in English, we tend to think that things become instantly available. And that speaks to our notion of the target language, not that I like that military metaphor, as being somehow sovereign. But we have to remember that in the original context, which is one of oral recitation, the ghazal does not throw itself away at one shot.
Right.
It emerges verse by verse, you're thinking of the refrain, you wait in some suspense to see what comes next, there's a rising wave of expectation, there's a whole series of reflexes and responses which you simply will not get in print. And there's also the fact that the ghazal does not necessarily, unless it is specifically the design, it's not a unified production.
True.
The verses fly off in different directions. They're held together by patterns of rhyme and cadence. But if you lose that, then to my mind, the ghazal becomes a centrifuge. So what I wanted to do here was to really go back to what is, in fact, in the Urdu tradition, the primary poem, which is the sher, the couplet. It is an independent poem in itself. And also I wanted to bring into English a form of textual production that is central to the Urdu hearing tradition, the bayaz, the notebook. So what used to happen in the old days was that at a mushaira, you would have your notebook, and if a particular couplet caught your attention, you would write it down in your bayaz. So it's not the case that people wrote down the whole ghazal. They had their favorite ashar. So this is my bayaz. So I just want to make a point that you don't have to replace forms of textuality in the original language with something else in English. Sometimes it's nice to go back to a form of transmission from the original language and see what that looks like.
And I think that is where we have a little bit of this slippage. I think the problem is because of the translation more than anything else. I think in English we also have this little sense of completion.
Yeah.
That you want to see the whole thing.
Correct.
Maybe even look at it, like that. But that's not how shades emerged.
No.
And that's not how ghazals emerged. So there was no obvious reason for you to follow that pattern. But looking at it from, say, an English reader's point of view, then that becomes a little bit of, I wouldn't say unease, but just a bit different. But this is fine. And then this thing which you said in the end, I think justifies everything, and that is that it is a bias. It is your notebook of Mir's shares, and you have picked the favorites that you liked, and they are 150 out of 13,000 shares, which is absolutely fine, I think. So this bias is Ranjit's own personal kind of choice, and I think we can just ask him now to read as many of his favorite shares as he can.
Gosh. How are you doing on time?
I don't know. Keep going. You can keep this one.
Oh my God. Okay, I'll get to that.
75 and 85.
Maybe I'll just read the English. If you can't keep quiet, at least try not to brag. The candle gets beheaded if its wick gets too loud.
85.
When the sky plays chess, you, me, okay. जहाँ शतरंज बाज़ंदे फलक हम हैं सब मोहरे बसाए शातिर नौज ज़ौक़ से मोहरों की ज़द से है. When the sky plays chess, you, me, we're all chessmen. Like every beginner, it enjoys breaking the pieces. क्या मैं भी परेशानी एक खातिर से करी था, आंखें तो कहीं थी, दिले गमदीदा कहीं था. Was that even me, the sum of my scattered anxieties? The eyes pointed one way, the heart grief-gazed another. That's one actually, you could just comment briefly on that. The usual understanding in translation is that your so-called target language is static and sovereign, and you're bringing things in from the source language. But I also think that there's a case for the target language itself to be changed on impact. It has to be flexible. Yeah, because it's not sovereign. That's a colonial and extractivist view of thinking about translation. And I think we should be open to changing our own language.
English is gained with every translation into English.
Which is also, even classically, the tradition from the Latin and the Greek. If you look at the history of English, I mean, English has absorbed a great deal and been formed by these translations from the classics. मेरी तहीरे हाल पर मत जा, इत्तेफाकात हैं ज़माने के. Don't go by how things have panned out for me. Stuff happens.
No, go ahead.
No, more.
Beautiful one.
Which one is that? After my death?
Just
Oh, that's by Nirdar. What also happens in this, at least in the introduction, is that there's a way in which this poetry flourishes in the context of other poetry around it. So I occasionally also have poems by his contemporaries. So this is Khwaja Mir Dard. बाद मरने के मेरे होगी मेरे रोने की कदर बाद मरने के मेरे होगी मेरे रोने की कदर तब कहा कीजिएगा लोगों में वो बरसातें कहाँ After my death, you'll learn to appreciate my tears. Then you'll tell people it'll never rain like that again.
How are we for time?
Yeah,
Okay, so let's have time for questions.
you could do that.
Yeah.
Oh, no
Oh, you
time for
don't want
questions.
time.
Oh, okay.
In which case,
What?
Ranjit,
What?
please,
More reading.
floor is yours.
Oh. There's a couple of things that I thought one could talk about because sometimes you're asked these questions about what's the place of translation. I think I've had occasion to think about that over many, many years. So I think this might be the point to also think back, as many of us, as you yourself, translate prodigiously. As Jerry was writing a number of poets, Shanta G, I'm going to say. But I think for many of us, translation is not something that we do in spare time or as separate from our normal practice
Very much.
or for academic brownie points, but it is something that is integral to our own work as writers and also as citizens. And I think, continuing our conversation from yesterday, Citizen Charles, the architect is citizen. I think we need to see ourselves also as people participating in larger historical processes. So to me, translation has always been a political commitment. So in the 20 years that it took me to translate Lal Ded, Laleshwari, Lala Rifa, there was no way to translate these poems from a Kashmiri wisdom tradition without reference to the fact that those were the very worst years in Kashmir's history. So it was very clear to me that I was translating those verses at a time when they resonated very strongly in the present as well. So it's part of the translator's ethic, I think, to be aware of this. Similarly, with the Mir, apart from the beauty of the Urdu itself, my linguistic and literary preoccupations, I think it's crucial that we retrieve these historical moments because we've forgotten the 18th century, largely. For a very long time, it's been the nationalists didn't particularly want it because it was too complex. There were too many different actors. There were South Asians, West Asians, Europeans, all coming together to produce this unpredictable culture. And of course, it didn't fit with imperial history because it came from before the time of the consolidation of empire. It's only now that wonderful scholarship has brought this period back to life for us. But it's a heritage we need to claim because the tendency is to look to the remote and somewhat imaginary past for our civilization sources. I think it's also important to look at something far closer at hand, because sometimes you miss that. So this is part of this larger historical commitment that I believe we have as poets and translators.
I think you're right. It's also kind of backgrounded by the events of the 19th century, which are much more, shall we say, dramatic and in your face. What we tend to see is that all these currents are slowly bubbling over a period of more than 100 years and developing to the stage that the events of the 19th century actually take place. And because, as you said, I think that is exactly what it is, that it's too complex and nothing kind of jumps out. It's all kind of part of continuums that one tends not to look at these in greater detail. And even a book such as this, I think, reverses that trend. It makes you once again look at a period and a kind of writing that emerges, especially in the light of what comes later on.
Exactly. It's that light of what comes later on that I look upon with dread. Because we now assume that these things have been present forever, right? That there is something called Hindi, which is based on Khadi Boli and is highly Sanskritized, and it is somehow identified with Hinduism. And that there's something called Urdu, which is more Perso-Arabic and is identified largely with Muslims. And this is the view that we are all being encouraged to simply take on board. It's a nonsensical view, because this official standard Hindi is about 100 years old. It's not an ancient language. It basically sprang out of the pages of a journal called Saraswati. What is true, empirically, experientially, is that you had this Hindavi continuum, out of which emerged various languages. And they were spoken, read, written in by people irrespective of ethnicity, religious, or regional location. And I think that it's that complexity that we need to recover today against the simple and toxic stories we're being told about ourselves. I think that's actually quite crucial.
A point about what is happening today is there is this kind of reductionism that is happening in language, and it's not only just Hindi.
No, so it's everywhere.
Depending on which community is speaking which language, there seems to be that happening in I am thinking of Gujarati, as a matter of fact, where depending on who you are, you can be pulled into the direction of a more Sanskritized Gujarati, or you can be pulled into the direction of a more Arabicized Gujarati, depending on who you are speaking with, and both of which are being done as agenda-driven things.
Exactly.
And what gets lost is the common person's Gujarati.
Yeah.
Or how it would have naturally developed on the streets.
Exactly.
And then fed back into the more formal processes. And that, I think, is a significant loss.
It is.
The chance that language is not allowed to evolve in its own manner, buffeted by all the forces of history and time and now technology and so on, but is restrained to be, purposefully formalized in a certain sense.
Well, which is why you need that historical consciousness, because so much of this goes back to the moment of 1857 to 1859, roughly. There is, in the first place, it's the formal end of the Mughal Empire that signals a whole series of anxieties on all hands, right? It manifests itself over the next 30 or 40 years in the emergence of this Khadi Boli meets Sanskrit kind of Hindi, where the intention is to overthrow what then gets called the Ritikal. So Braj Bhasha is seen as somehow effete, full of shringar, and there's an urge towards what its proponents actually call a more muscular and masculine Hindi. On, if you will, the other side, there's a sense that this is the end of feudalism and one must embrace the new modernizing forces. So in commentators and anthologists and educators like Hali or Sir Syed or Azad, you have a turn towards what they call a natural poetry. So many of these poets are seen as feudal relics. And there's a turn towards poetry which is really modeled on what's coming in through colonial pedagogy, Wordsworth and so on and so forth. That becomes the gold standard.
What about the impact of Arabic on the Urdu?
And that's the other thing, because of the pressure to assume certain identities within the new British Raj, effectively, there's a certain reaching back to perceived classical traditions. So I think by the time it gets to Ghalib, for instance, Ghalib is still highly Persian. But with Iqbal, you see that both in his politics and his language, he's reaching out to membership of a global Ummah. That's shifting. And then there are writers in the newly emergent Hindi who are looking back to another set of references in the classical Indic past. So this is where there is a parting of ways which we now need to see in context and to remedy through how we read and what we translate and how we discuss these questions.
So I think what it does come down to is the fact that we should allow languages to be, perhaps not kind of bring them down into specific conglomerations, which then tend to lose where they come from. Hindi being probably the best example of that. And I'm wondering whether that can be rescued once again, in the sense that people can just say that they are writers in Khadi Boli or writers in TAQI.
In the movies.
Yeah. No,
It's actually happening in the movies.
Yeah.
Where you actually, during, what was it, sometime during the COVID nightmare, I remember we turned something on, that's supposedly a Hindi movie. It was all in Bunderi.
Oh.
And it was absolutely fantastic. So I think, and there's of course Bhojpuri cinema, and I think
there's a Dakkani cinema.
There is a Dakkani cinema. So I think it's in these popular media, if you will, that there is some recovery of these. This is not to speak to whatever ideological pressures come with that kind of turn, but certainly the languages I think are coming back into the public sphere.
I need to read some more.
Okay, another of my pet peeves, of course, is that there is no such thing as a dialect.
Open it to questions after this.
Okay.
Just a comment. The government patronage will not let language.
Exactly. Give me the mic.
But nothing else.
Yeah.
But let's pick up on that. I'll read two more and then let's open it up to चश्मे दिल खोल उस भी आलम पर यहाँ की औकात ख्वाब किसी है. Open the heart's eye to that other world, and this one would be written off as a dream.
Can we open it to questions?
Yeah, we can do that.
We have time.
Oh, I'll read this one, last one. अजब होते हैं शायर भी, मैं इस फिरके का आशिक हूँ, कि बेधड़के भरी मजलिस में ये असरार कहते हैं. Poets, they're amazing. I just love that lot. Unfazed, they'll broadcast secrets to an assembly.
And I cannot think of a better moment than to, and we have a little time to open this to the audience, and we have a question here and here.
If it's Aarti, there'll be 3 questions.
First, thanks a lot for giving the timeline, because normally when we reach poetry, we don't take the climate, political or otherwise into consideration, which is great, especially for a novelist like me. Secondly, when you said a word like stuff happens, what's the original word for stuff in I mean, I can't imagine anything like stuff in Urdu.
Of course not. He says, ittifaqat hai zamane.
Okay. And second question, sorry. Did you purposely pick the poems, I mean the ones that you did the first half, keeping in mind the political climate right now?
Obviously.
Okay. Sorry.
I mean, we have to be responsive to the times we are present in.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's true.
Which is why also Mir is so alive to us today. I mean, his experiences are our experiences. The world, what I've called the affective community that he took for granted, couldn't be taken for granted anymore. He was turned into a refugee in his own country. There was this tremendous sense of being under pressure, being a migrant, being the poet of a shattered world. I think globally, this is the scenario. And this is why his voice resonates so strongly for us today.
I just had a simple question. Do you think instead of a literal translation, a gist would have been better? Have you tried that and not, or thought that it's not working that way?
Sorry, say that again.
A gist of it rather than a literal translation.
This is not a literal translation. Besides literal, I've been asked this many times by people, which is that a literal translation? My answer is not very simple. There are no literal originals. Yeah. So there can be no literal translations.
This is self-assured.
And no, there's, if you mean a paraphrase, in the first place, I don't think anyone can offer a gist of poetry. This is what has murdered the education of literature here as elsewhere. The idea that you can offer some essence. Poetry is in the doing. Yeah? So gists and paraphrases of poetry are profoundly useless.
I can add to that in a small way, and that is, as translators, one of our endeavors is that it should stand alone in English. So literally doing anything is a bad idea, because in the end it should stand in the language in which you are translating. Okay, and if you have read some of the best translations in the world, they look as if they are in English in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, so like that.
Yeah, I have two questions. Number one, how big a role would you say does, say, alcohol and perhaps opium play in the writing of these couplets?
Or the
Not your
translation.
translation, the original couplets. That's one question. And the second one is, you yourself are a poet and you are also a translator. You have your own original works and you translate these couplets. Does translation give you the same kind of satisfaction as writing your own original work?
Okay, response to the first question is, if you're interested in a certain kind of biographical approach to poets, then these questions may be relevant. But I don't think anyone ever wrote great poetry under the influence. And you would have that even from various practitioners who we knew rather well. So that's part of the story. So even Pinto, help me out, in Xanadu de Kubla Khan. Coleridge. So Coleridge, for instance, it's very clear, there's an image of this man as an addict. It's very obvious that everything he wrote as poet and philosopher was done with great precision. So I would set that kind of question aside for a more biographical inquiry, but I don't think it ever answers the question of what makes poetry work. That's one. And about me, I don't actually see translation as something other than or aside from my practice as a poet. I think these run together. And for many of us, I think we had very inspiring examples before us. We had A.K. Ramanujan, Agha Shahid Ali, to name but two, of a number of the poets who preceded us who really saw translation as part of their own work. In fact, if you look, there's an amazing book called Soma, which brings back into play Ramanujan's unpublished work in a transitional phase. You see how closely those poems are related to his translations. Yeah, so I wouldn't make that distinction between original poetry and translation.
Morning, sir. Morning,
Yeah,
sir.
sure.
Firstly, I would like to say that the work you've done is very incredible. So my question is that, as you previously mentioned, that he was known as the poet of love and melancholy, and people have interpreted his work as romanticized. But I cannot help but notice an air of rawness and honesty and a sense of deep relatability. What do you think about that?
Deep what again?
Deep relatability.
Relatability.
As they say in the Western, good for ya. But no, I'm very glad that you noticed that, because the tendency, certainly in some commentatorial traditions in South Asia, has been to work with hyperbole and what I have to say, fairly bogus ways of addressing poetry. So if you call somebody the Khuda-i-Sukhan, the god of poetry, if you set someone up on that kind of pedestal, there's no real possibility of critical engagement. Or then you arrive very quickly at an anecdotal way of presenting a poet as an eccentric, solitary figure, melancholy, etc. Return to the empirical experience of reading the poems, and that's where you'll find what kind of poetry it is. So I think for me this is also an argument about renewing a form of criticism. And you're absolutely right, it's everything you said. It's raw, it's vulnerable, it opens itself out. So, but it's also humorous and playful and self-ironic. I mean, I didn't read some of those poems.
Yeah.
You need to buy the book and read those for yourself.
I have to kind of stop here. We are out of time completely. And I just would like to thank Ranjit for this wonderful conversation. And I thank all of you for being such a wonderful audience and asking the questions you did. I don't think I've enjoyed myself more, and I have the best seat in the house. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.